Garfield's Babes and Bullets is a short Garfield film from 1989. This is directed by Phil Roman, Bob Nesler and John Sparey. It's written by Jim Davis. And we have Lorenzo Music voicing Garfield. And I really don't know how I feel about this. To begin with, I didn't like it. But then as I started to watch it, I was thinking, actually, it's not so bad. But if I were to rank all of the Garfield films, it would probably come near the bottom, but that's largely down to personal preference. But before I go any further, I will say this has 8 out of 10 on IMDb across 539 reviews and ratings, so it might not be the largest pool of opinions, but that's still a really respectable score, or overall rating. So while I'm about to say I didn't really love it, but it was okay, it does seem to be well received, so definitely bear that in mind if you're considering watching it. It's done in black and white. Now, I watch a lot of classic cartoons, a lot of classic cartoons, many of which are in black and white. I don't have an issue with the black and white, but Garfield usually has a really great colour palette. We have a lot of pastels and soft colours, and occasionally we'll have a bright pop of colour, and I love that. I am, of course, talking about the Garfield shorts from around this time in the 80s. So taking away that element, that is one aspect that I didn't love as much as I do with other Garfield films. And then we have the narrative. And this is where it's a personal preference thing. Garfield is bored and he finds an old-fashioned coat and hat and he decides to pretend that he's a private detective. And I hate it. Not just in Garfield. In general, I'm sure I've mentioned this before when I've reviewed similar narratives. I just don't care for this classic detective kind of story with the voiceover narration and the seedy kind of music. I don't care for it at all. And honestly, it's not even a case of if it's done right, I like it, because to my recollection, I've yet to have an example of where I've actually liked it. And that's the case here as well. That part of it, I just didn't care for. I didn't enjoy. But the narrative itself, I was curious to find out what had happened. A woman approaches Garfield as the detective because she believes her husband has been murdered. And Garfield takes on this case. And I was curious. I was curious to find out what had happened. I wasn't completely invested, but it was enough for me to watch this without feeling bored or anything. Whereas if the narrative had been something different, basically if it didn't involve either murder or a missing person, I feel like anything else would have been really dull to me. So they got the narrative right in terms of personal preference, but I really don't care for this classic detective style. But that is definitely down to what I look for, or I guess what I avoid. If this is your kind of thing, then you might well enjoy it, but it still isn't as good visually as a lot of the brightly coloured Garfields. That's not to say they didn't do a good job with the animation, because I guess they did. But for me personally, I just prefer the ones that are bright and more colourful when it comes to Garfield specifically. So needless to say, there are several elements that I just didn't personally care for with Garfield's Babes and Bullets, but I did like the mystery. I did like that part of the narrative. So I didn't love it, but I think there's certainly an audience for it. And I guess that's further explained by the 8 out of 10 on IMDb, which is, for a short film, is a really, really brilliant rating for any film, really. So definitely check it out if it sounds like it would appeal to you. Check it out indeed if you're a fan of Garfield. But for me personally, watching Garfield's Babes and Bullets was once enough. I didn't hate it, but there are too many things in it that don't appeal to me that meant that ultimately I didn't love it. Not the worst thing in the world, but I wouldn't be watching it again.